From the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service, the Quicksand Family Consumer Science Agents would today like to teach you how to make kraut. Glenn, when we make any fermented food products, it has to stay in the brine for about 3 weeks. Could you tell our audience what brine is?
Yes, brine is simply made using 1.5 tablespoons of canning salt in 1 quart of water. You just heat the water and the salt together and then let it cool.
Why do we have to use canning salt? Why can't we use just regular table salt?
If we use regular table salt, there are minerals in there that could cause the brine to become cloudy.
Can we alter our recipes, or do we have to use certain recipes?
Oh, you need to always follow the recipe exactly, because this is a food safety issue as well as the color and the flavor, but mostly for food safety.
So Glenna's going to now tell us she has some sauerkraut ready for us to process today. She's going to tell us how she got it to this point.
Okay, you have to start kraut about 3 weeks before you really want to process it. So this was started about 3 weeks ago. You start with about 25 pounds of fresh cabbage. You want to remove those dark green leaves from the outside, because that can also make your cabbage look greenish instead of whiter. Shred your cabbage or chop your cabbage. You can use a food processor or you can use a hand chopper. Then you want to fill your jars. Well, there's different ways that you can actually prepare your kraut. You can use a large crock and put your cabbage down in that and then add the salt to it and let it ferment in this crock. If you do that, you have to weight down the cabbage by putting a jar filled with water on top of that kraut to help keep the kraut from floating to the top. But I think most people in our area prefer to go ahead and put it in jars. So they chop the cabbage, push it down into the jar so you get it in firmly into the jar, and then you can put 1.5 teaspoons of canning salt into the jar and then cover the cabbage with cold water. And you put the lid on loosely because it's going to ferment. And you do need to let it ferment for about 3 weeks. And you can see I have placed all of these jars on an old cookie sheet. You don't want to use your good cookie sheet because it's going to rust.
Why is it going to rust?
As the fermentation takes place, the brine is actually going to bubble out of the jars. It's going to run down the side of the jars and onto the whatever you have it placed on. So that's why we recommend using an old cookie sheet, because it's going to turn rusty because the salt is actually bubbling out of the jars.
How often do you need to check it?
Well, I would check it every 3 or 4 days. You may find that scum is starting to grow on top of the jars. This actually has mold growing on the jar, on the top of the kraut. And I could have prevented this. This has a rotten smell. I could have prevented this if I had checked it every 3 to 4 days and had removed the scum from the top of the jar. And then also, if I had continued to add more brine to keep the cabbage covered, then this would not have happened.
So this one is not safe at all to eat?
Oh, no. This one we need to throw away. We're going to put the lid back on it because there is mold growing in there and we don't want to breathe any of that.
So we've checked it. We can add brine to it to keep it going, keep it working. It's what we call it in our area. How do we tell when it's ready? When is it ready to process?
Well, it's ready when it quits working. And by working, you can actually see, it's not happening in these anymore, but you would actually see bubbles working its way up through the jar. And that's where the fermentation is still taking place. And as long as you see the bubbles moving up, that means that it has not finished fermenting. So you really want to watch the temperature of the fermentation as well. Some of these jars are, are a little darker. Kraut will get dark if it's allowed to ferment in an area that's too warm. And ideally, the temperature should be kept between 70 and 75 degrees, which is, what it is in most air-conditioned homes. But sometimes people will put this on their porch because it can get kind of stinky, and smelly as the fermentation process is taking place. And if you put it outside, with air temperatures normally in the summer being, in the mid-80s, that can actually cause your kraut to spoil.
Right. Now, we're talking about processing now. My grandma didn't process her kraut.
No, there's still a lot of people who don't process, but we can't recommend that anymore. We have to recommend that you do process your kraut. So this is the point that we're at today. We're ready to process this kraut. It has completed its fermentation. And we have our brine already made. And what we're going to do is add just a little bit more to each jar. You want to have about a ½ inch head space left in the jars, but you do want to have, to refill the liquid that has worked out of the jar. And then we're going to put clean lids back on the jar. And we have heated our lids. They're here warm water, not boiling.
Not boiling.
This is just hot water. You don't want to boil your lids because they can actually damage the rubber. So,
can you reuse your lids from season to season?
Oh no. No, once your lids have been used, you need to discard those lids and use a new lid each time you can another item.
What about the rings?
The rings can be used until they begin to get rusty. So, just keep washing those rings and keep them dry, and they will last a long time. You'll get many years of service. So now we just want to screw on the lid, and you don't want to get it super tight. Just screw the lid on. And if you'll help me do this, we'll get it ready to go into the canner. We're using a rack that goes in the bottom of a boiling water bath canner, and we're going to set 7 pints in this rack. And we already have our boiling water canner on the stove. It's the water's heating up because you want to put this into warm water. It doesn't have to be boiling because this is cold, so you don't want a sudden temperature change. So what we're going to do now, we're going to lift this rack up and take it to the stove to process.
Okay.
We're going to put the lid back on. The water should cover the top of the jars by at least an inch. That gives it plenty of room to boil. And once it starts boiling again, we're going to process that for 25 minutes.
Okay. So we put it into our deep cooker, a water bath, or if we have just a big cooker that is deep enough that we can put our food that we like to process in there, and it can be covered by an inch. That cooker will work also if we don't have a so-called water bath.
You don't have to have a water bath cooker. Anything that's deep enough for your jar to be totally immersed will work. You don't have to have a rack like this, even though you can purchase these racks separately. You can use just folded towels, to go on the bottom of that deep kettle. Or if you have a pressure canner, there's this nice little rack that comes in the bottom of that. If it will fit down inside that cooker, you can use that.
Okay.
Okay? So now we're ready to process
Okay.
this.
As we move to the stove. Okay, I will take the lid off the cooker for you, off our canner.